Hello and welcome to the Home Edify podcast. My name is Kristen Malfris. Edify means to teach or instruct so as to improve the mind and character. And here we talk about what it takes to raise courageous, resilient, lifelong learners. If you are new here, I just want to say welcome. Oh my goodness, I am so happy that you are here listening in, taking your time that is so precious to listen to this podcast. It means so much. If you are a steady listener, also thank you so much for being here. If you don't mind, go and leave us a review. It would mean so much and it would help other moms who need to hear this encouragement. It would help them find this podcast. So, this week on the podcast, I am interviewing Leah Nicklause. Leah has a Instagram account that is so worth following. I get so many book recommendations from her account. She talks about gospel-centered motherhood, and at the time that I posted this podcast, I was really diving in. What is the difference between the Charlotte Mason philosophy and the classical conversations philosophy of homeschooling? And a lot of this conversation is going to reflect those questions that I had in mind. So if you are a new homeschool mom and you're trying to figure out what methodology you want to use for your homeschooling, this is a great listen because she dives into what is the Charlotte Mason philosophy, which is what she talks about most on her own Instagram account. She is the mom of 5 boys, and she is going to constantly be pointing you back to Jesus in everything that she posts. And this conversation was just so fun to have with her entirely. I learned so much, and I know that you will too. So let's get to it. So, Leah,
Mhm.
can you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Yes. So I'm Leah and I live in Iowa. And I have 5 boys that are between the ages of 2 all the way up to 10. So we are very involved in our local church and we are very involved in our local homeschool co-op. And we homeschool and we follow a Charlotte Mason philosophy. I think we are in our 6th year of homeschool. No, our 5th year of homeschool. We're going into our
Oh,
6th
wow.
year next year. And it's just been a really great blessing.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So, what led you to homeschooling? Did you always know you were going to homeschool, or what did that look like?
So my husband and I knew, even when our children were very young, we knew we wanted to homeschool. I didn't really know a lot about different educational philosophies or different approaches to schooling, but I knew that I wanted to homeschool and I knew that I wanted to give my children a Christian education. So even though we knew that, we didn't necessarily know how we wanted to approach school. I thought I would just do school at home. I didn't know there was much to it. But the more I learned, the more I was really drawn to educational philosophy and kind of exploring all the different approaches.
Okay. So, were you public schooled?
So my husband and I both went to public school.
Very cool. Me too. Same thing. Public school. So learning how to homeschool was like a whole new adventure altogether. But so how did you get introduced to Charlotte Mason? What led you to that philosophy?
When my children were still very young, I remember reading a lot and researching about the importance of reading to your children and the importance of literature. And I knew that I wanted to have a literature based homeschool. And around that same time, I had a friend who had been homeschooling and then had heard about Charlotte Mason and started to apply some of her principles and some of her practices into her own homeschool. And she was just so excited about it and began sharing it with others. So the more I learned about Charlotte Mason, the more I saw how it resonated with me and how I wanted to approach education. So I started to read a book called For the Children's Sake by Susan Schaefer Macaulay. And for many moms, that is kind of the door that opens the world to Charlotte Mason. So the more I read, the more it really resonated with me. And I could see this really beautiful biblical education that was very life-giving. So that's where I was initially drawn to Charlotte Mason and to learning more about her philosophy.
That's awesome. And so how old are your kids?
So my oldest is 10 and he's in 4th grade. And then I have a 9-year-old who's in 3rd grade, a 7-year-old who is in 1st grade, an almost 5-year-old. He's not 5 yet. He is still 4 and he's in the early years is what we would call him, under age 6. And then I have a toddler who is 2, but he's our baby. So he's basically still a baby.
I gotcha. Okay. So, well, describe what is the Charlotte Mason philosophy, just like in a nutshell, for a mom who may be listening who's like, okay, what is Charlotte Mason? What is this philosophy? How do I apply it?
Yeah. So Charlotte Mason was a 19th century British educator. So she lived at the end of the 1800s into the 1900s. And she had a really beautiful approach to education. So she recognized that all children are born persons, as she calls it. So that's her first
Mm,
principle. And she recognized that God made all people in his image, and there is an inherent beauty and dignity and value in that. So she really championed the way that we treat our children to make sure that we're respecting them, respecting their personhood. So Charlotte Mason developed this philosophy of education, and it was very much rooted in kind of the classical world and the classical tradition, while also for her time and place was very progressive. So that became, the Charlotte Mason philosophy. And she has 20 principles that are often associated with her name. And then we can also see some of her practices in the way that she ran her school. So she ran what was called the PNEU schools, and we can see some of the actual work that they did and how they took that philosophy and took those principles and how they kind of lived it out.
And that's one of the things that I really like about her philosophy is that first thing of children are born persons. Because I feel like throughout curriculum, if you're a homeschool mom and you're diving in, I feel like you can be overwhelmed by a lot of child-based curriculums, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Where it's like you're not treating the child like they are fully capable of absorbing, I don't know what's the word, absorbing good. Like, how do you explain that?
Well, I think what you're saying kind of resonates with the analogy that Charlotte Mason uses, which is to spread a wide feast. And just
Yes.
acknowledging that children are so capable of engaging with these living ideas. And I think as moms and as educators, so often we can limit the feast because we think, oh, they're not ready for this, or well, I don't know if they're interested in that. And so we limit the feast that we put before them. But children are so capable of engaging with things, even if they're not interested. There's so much in spreading this wide feast that they can take and they can learn from. And that doesn't mean they will love everything or enjoy all of it, uh, or be good at everything. And that's okay, because the work is worth being done, whether or not we enjoy it and whether or not we're, quote unquote, good at it or excel at it. So it's been really a big blessing to me to also have that same wide feast of education.
I bet you've learned a lot because I feel like as I'm diving in, I just finished reading Home Education and I'm starting on the philosophy of education. But oh my goodness, I've learned so much just by reading her stuff. Like I didn't even know Plutarch was a thing until I went through.
Either.
That is so wild. So what's the craziest thing you've learned while diving into the Charlotte Mason philosophy?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think the most interesting thing I've learned is probably actually about myself. Growing up, I would always say, like, oh, I'm not really good at history. Like, I would memorize what I needed to know for a test, do fine on the test, and then I would forget everything because it didn't
Mm,
engage with me. But I am so fascinated by history. I feel like I'm like coming alive. Like, I feel like I'm actually enjoying.
agreed.
Yeah, it's so great. And with that, even you mentioned Plutarch. I had never even heard of Plutarch in high school. And yet my fourth grader is engaging with Plutarch and reading him. And I'm just so thankful for that. And I'm thankful for my education, but I'm so grateful that I get to redeem it and go so much deeper with my kids.
And okay, so explain Plutarch because he basically he was a Greek philosopher. Is that right? Who?
So if you look for like Plutarch's lives, so you can read kind of these different stories about different people that he wrote about. And we're only in our first year, so I feel very much a beginner in the world of Plutarch, but it's been so good because it's so challenging. And I think it would be
Mm,
easy to look at it and say, this is too hard. We're going to not do this. And there's absolutely a time and place to acknowledge when your child is a born person. We want to
oh,
be aware of that
absolutely.
child. But there's also a time and place like this is hard, but like by God's grace, we can do hard things. And it's challenging. Like I have felt very challenged by it, but I'm so excited to see how we grow over the next years as we continue slowly, steadily doing Plutarch and Shakespeare and so many other challenging subjects.
So, okay, you'd mentioned that she had a classical form of education, right? But that it was progressive for its time, especially. But what a lot of people do classical education. I know we've talked before through
Mhm.
social media of what is the difference between classical education and Charlotte Mason, and because you see a lot of those two particular types of homeschooling methods. What is the difference and what led you to a Charlotte Mason methodology versus something like classical conversations?
So I think what's so challenging about this topic is one, it is really hard to define classical education because it is so broad. And there's so much to it. So to give kind of a quick summary even is challenging. But even so with classical education, we are often talking about this idea of education, this philosophy and approach that goes back to the Greek and Roman times. And so you're going to hear names like Plato and Aristotle, and you're going to see over time, there become like a Christian influence. So often we are talking about Christian classical education because in classical education, with the search for truth, well, that truth is found in Christ. And so that truth is fully realized in the person and work of Christ. So often you hear classical education. Many of us are talking about this tradition that goes back to Greek and Roman times. And we were talking about a biblical approach to these like really rich and life-giving ideas. And Charlotte Mason, when she was writing, would have been familiar with so many of these philosophers and writers and these ideas. So even though she's maybe not using the same terms that we might see, the idea is still there. So for example, when I read The Liberal Arts Tradition, which is a book that is kind of about that broader world of classical education, the very first chapter is about piety. And so this duty that we have to God and to others. And we see that really resonating in Charlotte Mason's philosophy. And she even, they have their PNEU motto, which is, I am, I ought, I can, I will. And we often say that as I am, I can, I ought, I will. So you kind of see it both ways. But the idea being like, we can, by God's grace, we have this duty to God and to others. So again, we're not seeing always the same terms. She did use the term piety, but maybe not to the extent. So we see kind of these threads of life-giving ideas in Charlotte Mason's works. So I think where it gets really confusing is there's also a movement that many would call more neoclassical. And that is actually very different from this really broad classical tradition from the works of Charlotte Mason. Dorothy Sayers had this very famous speech called The Lost Tools of Learning. It was later published as an essay. And in that, she takes this idea of the trivium, which is grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And that trivium, along with the quadrivium, is part of the seven liberal arts. And so again, that's a very classical idea. So Dorothy Sayers gave this speech, and she kind of mentioned what if we reimagined the trivium as based on kind of stages of development, which, in the mid 1900s is a very progressive idea, a very new idea based on modern psychology. So that morphed into what we would call maybe like an ages and stages model or a trivium based model. And many would call that neoclassical, meaning a new version of classical education, a new version of reimagining the trivium. Unfortunately, what gets really confusing is the neoclassical model will often just use the word classical. And I think that gets really confusing. And so I'm sorry, I hope I've explained that okay.
No, that you did for sure. And I think that part of it had me really confused because I'm still trying to understand what I, I'm a homeschool mom of a 5-year-old, fixing to be 6-year-old. So I'm like trying to dig down and figure out what am I going to use as my my plan for educating her for the long run. And I've looked at the classical conversation side of it a little bit, but I was really confused for that same reason because they use the word classical. But I'm realizing, okay, just like you were saying, and I've learned a lot from you and your content on this, but that it's not the same thing, particularly as those early classical, when you think Greek and Roman and all that, like it takes the same ideas, but it's something different in the same breath. So that is super interesting, but that helps clarify a little bit to me about like what Charlotte Mason is and what the difference is for anybody that's listening. So when did you start diving into Charlotte Mason? At what point with your kids?
So I'm very thankful that I learned about Charlotte Mason when my children were pretty young. I think my oldest was 4 when I started learning about this philosophy. It's never too late. It's never ever too late to like learn things and to apply them to our homeschools. But because I learned about Charlotte Mason when I did, I had quite a bit of time to learn about her philosophy and especially to learn from others. So being in a local book club was so helpful because I had moms who were already actually doing school and I was able to learn from them and see how I can have all these ideas and I can learn this philosophy, but how do you actually live it out? And so that was very helpful as I was kind of on my homeschool journey.
Oh, that's awesome. And you're big into books. Like your whole Instagram is like full of recommendations for books. Well, how do books play a part in the Charlotte Mason philosophy?
Yeah, that is such a great question because books are so important. I mean, in the homeschool world in general, we love our books.
Oh yeah.
But Charlotte Mason really encouraged the use of living books. And so what that means is that when we read a well-written story, there's kind of this idea, this living idea that sparks within us. And so the heart behind using living books would be to really connect a child mind to mind with these great authors and thinkers. So for example, when we're studying history, we can use a book that's going to be written by an expert and that's kind of written in a narrative form and is really going to bring that story to life for the child. So living books were a really important part of her curriculum. They aren't the only part of her curriculum. I think sometimes people kind of associate Charlotte Mason with like books and nature, which are both awesome things. And she definitely loves both of those things, but there's a lot more to it. So, but with living books, we're often using those to help a child have that spark. So rather than, I think about like maybe what were more dry textbooks that I used growing up. And there may be a time and a place for those, but to put a living book in front of our child and to watch this come to life. And then with living books, Charlotte Mason really encouraged narration. So to narrate is just the art of telling back what you heard. And as children do that, they have to use the habit of attention. And then as they tell back, they are really solidifying that information and that material. And they're really showing us what stood out to them, what they heard in the story. And there are so many times where my boys will narrate and I'm like, I totally missed that. I'm the one who read it, but somehow I still overlooked it because I was focused on this other part. And so it's very cool to watch narration draw these things out of our children from these really excellent living books.
Oh, that's awesome. Dude, that is so cool. You mentioned that she covers other things besides just books.
Mhm.
What does it look like covering math, the sciences with a Charlotte Mason curriculum?
So some of that might depend on the age of your child. But for math, for example, math itself is such a living language. And so for us, the way that looks is using manipulatives to kind of have a better grasp of how one and one make two. Well, it's literally here's this one block and here's this other block. And now we have two blocks, which sounds so simple. But to use these concrete things to start with before we move into more abstract ideas. And then with science, a lot of times in those earlier years, in those first couple of years of education, the focus is really on building a foundation of nature study. And so to learn about to like explore and to observe and to learn about God's creation as the foundation for science. So that trains us to observe. It trains us to be able to classify things, to take notice and to take note of things. A lot of families will use a nature journal. And then as we're doing that, we're really training our children and ourselves to take those same skills and to use them in different, as we move on to maybe more challenging science.
Okay. So you mentioned habit of attention. You're talking about observing things. What she is big, it seems, from what I have read, and I am totally new at this. So correct me on anything if you hear that I'm saying anything wrong. But she seems to be huge on habits. And you were just talking about the habit of attention. What are habits as far as Charlotte Mason's philosophy goes, and how do you implement them? And I know you as a mom of all boys, what does that look like for you especially?
So Charlotte Mason talks about basically the three tools that we have as we are teaching our children, and that would be atmosphere, discipline. So Charlotte Mason talked about three tools that we have when it comes to educating our children. And I think these are super applicable whether or not we are doing home education. But she talks about an atmosphere, a discipline, and a life. So with
Mm,
atmosphere being the very air we breathe in our home. So just thinking about how we conduct our home, we want to have an atmosphere that is so loving and encouraging and built on truth. And then with discipline, she's referring to the discipline of habits. And then lastly, with a life, it's referring to those life-giving ideas. So with the discipline of habits, I like to think of it in kind of two ways. The discipline of like our hands, of like the physical things that we're doing, and then the discipline of our heart. So, for example, if we are teaching our children, okay, when you come home, you are going to take your shoes off right away and put them over here. So that would be a very like a physical discipline where they're learning to do something with their bodies. And then there's also the
mhm.
discipline of our hearts. So if we're teaching our children to say please and to say thank you, or to ask in a certain way, to ask with a cheerful heart, and that's kind of for maybe our younger ones. And then as they get older, those habits might look different. So, for example, my oldest might be working on the habit of loading the dishwasher after dinner and making sure he checks for all the dishes before he starts it. And then from a heart attitude, maybe he's working on, okay, when I come to the table for lessons, I need to come with a cheerful heart. And so habits are so hard. I think they're hard for me as well because I think we can have all these lofty ideas of what we want our homes to look like. But really, with habit building, we want to start kind of slow and steady. So having just one habit that we work on at a time, really encouraging our child and having their will on our side. So this is not something we're like, I'm going to teach you this, you're going to learn this, but more bringing our child in because we are for them and because we
Mm.
know what is best for them, and to show them why it is a blessing to have these good habits. And so I think that's what can be really challenging. So then to have 5 boys, often there's different things I'm working on with each of them. And honestly, all of us can use the habit of arriving to the homeschool table with a cheerful heart. So I know that's a big habit. Another habit that I'm working on, especially with my 4-year-old, is to not interrupt the lesson. We've talked about what an emergency is and why it's always okay to interrupt in an emergency, but there's rarely emergencies and he interrupts a lot. So we are working on putting his hand on me so then I know, okay, this tells me that you have something you want to say, or wait till the lesson is over. So yeah, so there's just a lot that we're working on. As we're habit training with all of them.
That's pretty cool. I do love how holistic Charlotte Mason is in all of her things that I mean, she goes from like a child as a whole person, and talks about that sort of thing, but even just like the habits, the soul of a child, the Christian philosophy, that is the part that blew me away, honestly, was the guide for Christian parenting. So, what's your thoughts on that? Like, do you follow that philosophy, that part of the philosophy, even in y'all's home? Like, what does that look like?
I think there's a lot that we do draw from Charlotte Mason. And ultimately, as my husband and I look at how we want to teach and train and parent our children, there are a lot of voices that we're listening to. First and foremost, we want to pray and seek the Lord, but we also want to seek the counsel of, the men and women in our church and our pastors. But I do think there are other voices that we look at that have a lot of weight. And I would say that Charlotte Mason's voice is one of them. And so as we kind of, with anything else, as we kind of look at how we want to apply it, we want to filter it through a lens of scripture and see, is this good? And is this true? And is this beautiful? And like, Lord, would you have us use this for our family? But when I look at, having an atmosphere, that really resonates with me to have a really life-giving home atmosphere. When I look at kind of habits, that also really resonates with me to teach and train my children in these good habits, so that they can love God, so that they can love others, so that they can serve with their hands, so that they can be a blessing, and so that they are set up for a, for their own success, like that these habits would bless them as they learn and grow and work. And so as I look at all of these things, they do really resonate with me from a biblical perspective. That said, I always want families, I always want moms to be really praying through how we approach these things and, not having kind of this idea or this standard that we think we have to live up to, but instead to just
Mm.
keep our eyes on Christ, and to pursue Him and allow these things to kind of come alongside us, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Dude, that's awesome. Yes. So what does gonna switch gears a little bit here, but what does your daily homeschool day look like? I know you mentioned gathering at the table in the mornings. What's just a summary of how you do life on a daily basis?
Sure. So in the morning, my boys will come down and have breakfast. And they, as part of their habit training, they have morning chores. And so they will have to, after breakfast, they have to get their morning chores done. And then when it's time for school, one of the things that I encourage them to do is I kind of give them like a 2 or 3 minute heads up. And I remind them to get their hearts, minds, and bodies ready for school. So to get their body ready means like, do you need a cup of water? Do you need to use the restroom? Are you cold? Do you need to bring a blanket? What do you need to do to make sure your body is like physically ready for school? And so that, 5 minutes into the lesson, you're not going to say, Mommy, I need water, and you're going to run out of the room. But I also really want to encourage them to have their hearts ready. So even encouraging them to like pray and ask God to help them come with like a humble, cheerful heart. And then to also have their minds ready. And I tell them, get your mind ready, like be prepared to engage with living ideas. Even if those things aren't, maybe they're not trying their hardest to make sure their heart is cheerful. That's okay, because it's a slow and steady habit of when I come to the table, there is an expectation that I would be humble and cheerful.
That's great. That was great.
But when we do come to the table and it's time for homeschool lessons, we start with our all together lessons. So we start with our Bible time and our poetry. We kind of have different things that we do throughout the week, whether that's artist study or hymn or folk song or our composer. And we do our copy work. And then we move into our lessons like either history or literature and geography. And we do a lot of these together, or we do some of them. Maybe my oldest is in what we would call Form 2. And so he has quite a few additional subjects than my younger boy. He is working on his own while I'm working with the next two. So then we do individual lessons. So for us, that is math. And then with my oldest, he has a couple of those additional lessons like grammar. He has science, Plutarch, some things like that. And then after lunch, my boys will have their independent reading. And for my third kiddo, he is still doing a reading lesson. So we'll have our reading lesson. And then in the afternoons, while the baby is napping, our goal is to do our like handicrafts or our painting or our drawing time. And for me, that's like often the biggest challenge, because sometimes in the afternoons it is a little bit harder. Maybe my baby doesn't want to nap, or I have a child who needs something. So a lot of times we have this ideal, like this is what we want our schedule to look like. This is the ideal version of our schedule. And then the real happens. And the real is that we didn't get to this today. We are really struggling with this lesson, or, oh, I forgot to, even though it's on the timetable, I forgot to do grammar. So there's a lot of like real life that happens. But because we have this really rich and wide feast, even when there's a distraction or something is disrupted, or, okay, I have to go help the baby get back down for his nap, whatever happens, we still have this really rich school day. And there are, of course, challenges and obstacles, and there are always going to be those. But because we have laid this wide feast, we can enjoy what we do get to, if that makes sense. Like what we have that day, it is good, and we can be really thankful for that.
And that's awesome, dude. That's one of the reasons why I love homeschooling, and the idea of homeschooling is being able to be flexible. And when you were talking about your son, like your son's talking about coming to the table with, a cheerful heart and all of those things, it's like one day they're going to have their adult lives where they're going to have to go to work or whatever it is. And I'm sure they're going to hear mom in the back of their minds over and over and over again of like coming to the table. You know what I mean? Like, let's have a cheerful heart. Like that's, or what is it? Prepare your mind for living ideas. Like,
Yes.
so like that's going to be on repeat, dude. Can you imagine the memories that they're going to have just from that? Like that's awesome. So you seem like a vivacious reader from what I have seen on your Instagram.
I do love books. I do love reading.
Well, what's your view on a mother's education part of being a homeschool mom? What does that look like?
Well, I love this question because I think we as moms, we just long for our children to be lifelong learners. And
Mm.
we often really long for them to be these strong readers. And we want them to be lifelong readers. And sometimes we as moms can struggle to live that out ourselves, even though we want that and we know it is good. And I have been there so many times. There's a newborn or you're pregnant, and there's just we have so much that we long for. And it's so easy because we love our children, and we spend so much time caring for them and educating them. And that is such a good and beautiful thing. But I have found so much encouragement and so many like life-giving times in pursuing my own education. So whether that is learning about educational philosophy and reading Charlotte Mason, or listening to a podcast about her, or other educational philosophies, or whether that is reading a nonfiction book, or growing in my theology understanding, and maybe learning something that is really challenging for me. Or it could be enjoying a fiction book and just growing as a reader. And I know one thing I've been really blessed with is just to go deeper into this really rich world of literature, and to see how those stories have shaped our culture, have shaped, the tradition of great literature, and how they are starting to shape me.
Mm.
And that has been such a blessing. So it doesn't have to be like these nonfiction books or something we, maybe think of this really big volume of something, but it can be so life-giving to read these enjoyable books, or to pick up our own handicraft. I always said, I'm not an artist. Art doesn't come naturally to me. But art doesn't have to come naturally to us to be an artist. God is a creator, and he has given us a desire to create. And I am never going to be the best painter that there ever was, but I don't have to be. I can do it because it's worth doing, and I can enjoy it because it's enjoyable. And even in doing that, I've been like impressed with how like my skills have grown. And again, you're not going to see like the famous watercolor painter by any means, but I really enjoy it, and I can feel really satisfied in watching my skills grow, if that makes sense. Or maybe that's baking or pursuing other oh no, it's showing reconnecting again.
Can you still hear me though? Is that
I can hear you. I
okay?
just
Well
can't
then,
see you.
okay. All right. Well, it should pop up here in just a second. Okay. Okay. So then I'm going to dive into the last question, which is what is a book that has shaped you and made you into the person that you are today?
Oh man. So this is such a good question. And I feel like there are 1,000. Okay, that's not true. But the one that I kept thinking about was the book Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortland. And
Mm,
I think sometimes a book just like speaks to you right where you are, and it's what you needed in that moment. And I've actually read it. I think I've read it 3 times now. But the reason I love it so much is because it just shows the heart of Christ for his people. And I would say it was very life changing for me to just really meditate on Christ's heart for me. Um, and to almost look at salvation through fresh eyes and to see just to be renewed in this beautiful gift of salvation that Christ has given me and who I am in him and how he sees me. Um, and I feel like that has really, really shaped me and grown me. And I
mm.
think just the way he approaches it, and it's just such a very accessible book. It's very, but it's also, it's very deep, but very accessible. So he is talking about these really beautiful ideas, but, not with necessarily like things like the theological jargon that's maybe hard to understand, but it's just so, it just meets you right where you're at. And it's just one I really go back to a lot.
Dude, that's awesome. And we will include that in the show notes as well. But Leah, thank you so much for being here. But is there any advice that you have for a mom who's jumping into homeschooling, or maybe she's just looking to get some encouragement as an everyday homeschool mom? Is there anything that you would say to her?
Yeah. I think my biggest encouragement for moms is to really spend time establishing your educational philosophy first. So, really looking at that as the foundation. So, whether you're drawing from the broader classical tradition, whether you're drawing from Charlotte Mason, whatever you're looking at, as you're thinking through, praying through, seeking counsel from others who know you and your family, taking that time to establish your educational philosophy will be such a blessing to you. And it doesn't mean you cannot adjust it or change it down the road as you learn and grow. But when we have this solid foundation, we can start to build on it, because I know we live in a day and an age where there are so many resources. We have access to so much, and it is a huge blessing, but it can also be really overwhelming. And when we don't have that solid foundation, we can just get blown and tossed around. And okay, she's using this curriculum. Oh, he's using that. Like we just see all these things that people are using or have good marketing or like
Mm,
people are out, and we just, oh, we want that because it makes sense, or I want this because my friend uses it, or she's had success with this. And it can be so much, and it can be so overwhelming. But when we have that foundation and when we know we have this settled approach to how we want to educate, we can look at something and say, hey, that looks really interesting, but I'm not sure that really aligns with what we're pursuing.
mm,
Or we like, oh, that's so great that that works for their family, but I'm not sure. Like, I'd have to really think about it and look at samples. It kind of slows us down versus like add to cart, all of the
mm.
things. But it gives us a lot more confidence when we do make those decisions, because I can say, I've looked this aligns with what we're pursuing. It doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean it will be the one and only true resource, but this makes sense for our family in this season. So my encouragement is, of course, seek the Lord above all else, but to really pursue your own educational philosophy and to keep your eyes on the Lord and not on all the million other things around us that can be blessings, but they can also be burdens.
I love that. I love that so much. Oh my goodness. So you can find Leah at the Living Bright Homeschool. That's her account on Instagram. Is there any other place they can find you, Leah?
I also have a website, but I'm definitely more active on social media. So my website is just livingbrighthomeschool.com. But yeah, the best place to find me is always going to be on Instagram.
And her book recommendations are out of this world, let me just tell you. So if you want to go head over to Instagram and follow her, I promise that it will be worth it for sure. So, Leah, thank you so much for being here. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to the Home Edify podcast. All literature, book recommendations, and websites mentioned in today's show will be linked in the details below. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube, and don't forget to follow along on Instagram at Home Edify Podcast to enjoy clips from our latest episodes and day-to-day encouragement. Our prayer is that you were inspired to seek after your child's heart and mind. Thanks again for listening.
So, Mom, are you done with your podcast?
Yeah, I learned so much.
Thanks for coming to the podcast. Bye.